Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Traeger, and I am your host for the Divine Fingerprints podcast today. We are joined by our guest, Jodi Cowles. Welcome, Jodi.
Thank you very much.
So Jodi has been working with me as I get to the publishing stages of my book, and she's been a wonderful help with that. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about her story, which is a exciting one that's kind of led her all over the world, and literally all over the world. Um, Jodi, I'm going to start with kind of a question about that. Divine fingerprints sometimes present themselves when you don't initially get what you're hoping for. This happened when you wrote your first book, so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I finally finished my first book when I turned 30. I had been working for a corporate insurance company in a cubicle for about 7 years, and I wrote this book on like every other weekend for a long time. It took a long time to finish. It was called the Minor Protection Act, and it came to me in a dream, and then in the idea. I had an aunt who was working in Pakistan and had some interesting opinions of Americans, and I thought, what would it look like if if Christians in America were persecuted? So I just hatched this novel idea. And when it came out, I lost my job. I got downsized. And so I thought, well, perfect. I'll take my retirement account, which was really, I don't advise anyone to do, stupid. But I took my retirement account and I bought a beater RV and I set out and traveled around the country trying to sell my book. And I poured everything, all my introverted little heart into meeting new people and trying to sell this book for I think it was 10 months in the end. It was a great experience. I sold very few books. I had a lot of positive feedback and it never went anywhere. And this was now 20 years ago. I said, okay, I guess publishing isn't for me. I guess I can write, but I can't sell. So I went in a different direction. And I ended up moving overseas and I worked for an international aid organization and I met my husband and we adopted our daughter. And when we finally came home, we came home about 2 years ago, and I've been processing a lot of my time overseas, a lot of the experiences and the griefs and all of it. And part of the processing was thinking through if my book had sold, if I had any kind of success, I would have had a completely different life. And my daughter would not have been adopted, at least by us, and I would never have met my husband. And so I'm putting out books. I'm putting out like my sixth book I'm writing right now. And I continue to write because it's the passion God has put on my heart. But the sales, I do my best and I just leave it out there because I don't know, maybe there is something better around the corner because I didn't become a best-selling author.
Well, I think that's as a new author myself, it feels like that's the part that's the hardest. I actually didn't feel like writing the book was maybe that hard, but the idea of trying to do all the marketing, and I have a master's in business and a bachelor's for marketing. It's not like I don't have the idea, but it's just the scarier part for sure, is that part and getting feedback on the book itself. As a financial literacy teacher, I'll also add definitely don't recommend the cashing in the 401k to any listeners out there. It's,
Caveat, bad
yeah,
choice.
we don't want to go down that road if we can avoid it, perhaps. But God can use everything as He gets us to where He wants us to be. Tell us a little bit more about how you went from that place of not selling the books the way you wanted to, and that disappointment to eventually going abroad.
Well, I came just blasting out of the cubicle as hard as I could after almost 10 years. So they got rid of the training department because they were trying to save $1 million. And then a year later, you can't live without training. So they hired us all back as consultants. And I just worked part-time from my home anyway for a couple of years. So I had 10 years of working for the insurance company and I was done with that. I had given them all of my youth and my enthusiasm, and I had learned a ton. I learned how to do distance education. I learned how to take and produce video. And so I was back in Boise, where I'm from, and our church has a long history of global outreach, and we take the Bible seriously, where it says Jesus tells us to, care for the orphan and the widow in their distress, and you should actually do that. So we worked with an aid organization that was doing that around the world. And I met my good friend, and he was explaining this extraordinary work that some of my colleagues, my future colleagues, were doing with like 5 bad pictures. That's what he had to explain his work. So I was done with my unsuccessful book tour, and my house was rented, and I was living with my folks, and I thought, I'm going to do something totally different. So I moved overseas to do video for this international aid organization, and I traveled around for about 4 years. I traveled about half the time in every possible terrible scenario that, not the non-Instagram places that you go, a lot of difficult situations. And my colleagues were living in very difficult situations, trying to be the hands and feet of Jesus in rough spots. And I would fly in and have some sort of ridiculous and dangerous travel, and then I would make it to them, and I would film their work, and then I would have a ridiculous exit, and then I would produce videos that they used for donation raising and informational purposes, reports, all of that. I was with them for 4 years, and then my husband and I got married, and we moved to Turkey because I had been to Turkey a lot. I'd been through Turkey because they have a great airport, and we started an English language business and lived in Turkey.
It's amazing the paths that we go. They're so often not straight.
For sure.
Yeah. So you've actually written more books, which I think is a cool part of the story too, in the sense that just because the first one didn't sell the way you wanted to, some people would have just quit and say, oh, I'm not going to write anymore, and just go down these other paths. And I think my understanding is you've used a lot of your international experiences in those books. What made you want to keep writing after that initial experience?
Well, I was never going to publish again after that initial experience, but writing is how I process in a lot of things, and how I go, what if? And every one of my books is a question that I am working through with God, is basically what it is. So I wrote my second book, Thirst, which is an allegory about pain, which always makes it seem really interesting to people to read. But I wrote that one summer in the middle of my travels, when I just saw one excruciatingly horrible thing after another. And living in, everybody knows we live in a broken world, but if you get outside your borders and your particular subculture, I think you get more exposure to it, just because you get exposed to things you're not used to. So I got exposed to a horrific amount of awful, and I wrote that book as a way of processing that. And then I wrote my third book, a novel about an aid worker getting kidnapped in North Africa, when I was trying not to get kidnapped in North Africa. I was afraid, and I had to work through the fear with the Lord, and that's why I write. I come up with these true-ish to life, but they're fiction, stories about my time overseas, and I'm trying to figure out something or two things with God. Like that novel, I was working through what does God allow to happen to some of his children in the process of rescuing others of his children. And so I was working through that and through fear, and I wrote a novel about it. And then we were in Turkey for 8 years, and it was all kinds of wonderful and horrible. In the last 4 years, we were trying to finalize our adoption, and we had COVID, and we had terrorist bombs and shootings and a coup and all the fun things of living overseas sometimes. And it was really, really hard at the end. And so I started writing a comedy. And I wrote Cold Turkey, which is my fourth book about I invented a teacher and sent her to teach at an international school in Istanbul. And it was so healing and helpful for my husband and I to remember the really hilarious things that just happen when you move into a different culture and a different language that you don't speak. And it was really fun to start writing that in the last 6 months we were in Turkey, because it was a mood lifter and helped me remember what I loved about the Turkish people while I was in a difficult situation.
That's cool. The third book sounds especially interesting, just in the sense for me of that processing that question of how, when, and I think it's very relatable to Divine Fingerprints, is that how, when God is working on something in you or in me, how does that impact other people? Because it takes you back to the Bible story about the pigs, where the demons got cast out of the man and into the pigs. And it's a great deal for the guy, who didn't have the demon anymore, but the pig farmer was probably not as enthusiastic about God's plan that day.
Yeah.
And it really feels like that's sometimes how God works, and that's sometimes how our stories interact with each other, where what God's doing in your story one day it may not have anything to do with me at all, but it may intersect my story or any listener's story on a given day.
And how do we, as mature believers, as maturing believers, how do we deal with that? And how do we remain faithful and also grieve and be healthy in saying, this is not something I would have chosen for myself, but also, this is what God chose for me. I mean, as long as we've not made some, horrible, sinful decision. But most of the time, this is something that God chose for me. So what is my assignment in the middle of this awful? And how am I supposed to remain faithful in the middle of this awful, instead of just focusing on the awful?
Right. I think the hardest part, as I've investigated Divine Fingerprints, is this idea, because I'm saying that God's intentional about everything, and that he's not dealing in luck and coincidences. How do you make your peace with those types of questions? How do you figure that part out? And I don't know that we're 100% even meant to totally understand what God's up to on this side of heaven. My pastor and I have always joked that we both kind of create a list of questions that we'll have for God when we get to heaven, of the things that we don't understand, and I think we both admit that list at times gets rather lengthy. That God's ways are higher than our ways, and all of those types of things that we're not always meant to understand. The beauty of Divine Fingerprints, as I've looked for them, is that they do help in a lot of ways. You see how, in your case, like you met your husband, and your family directly came from one of those hard times where you didn't get what you wanted. But that doesn't mean that every hard time in your life or my life or the listener's life is going to resolve itself so cleanly or so obviously. It could resolve itself 20 years further down in our lives, or we may never really get the resolution we want. So it's a challenge in that sense.
It is, and I think the most important thing for me is the focus on the fact that I know in my bones that God is good, and I don't need to understand. Like, I need to be honest with God. I need to ask my questions, but I don't need to understand. I can.
Amen.
I have learned enough. I've been through enough trauma that I know that most of what I have in everyday life is above my pay grade, and He is good. And if I don't see it, that's my blindness. It's not His goodness that's at question.
Right. Yeah. His fingerprints show His character, not because I've ever deserved it or any of us have ever deserved it, but just because He is that good.
Yeah.
That's a great point. So, what would you say, with all of your time abroad and all of these different places, what would you say Americans who have not traveled extensively, which includes me, biggest misconception would be of Turkey or the Middle East or some of those areas that you spent a lot of time in?
That's a great question. From what I saw, most Americans who came abroad either thought it was going to be basically America Light, and so they acted in a way that was super offensive, and they did things that are legal in America and not legal in other places, so there's a naivete to it, and I think there's either a naivete or there's a radical fear, and in my experience, there are things to fear in other cultures, just like there are things to fear in our cultures. But I think there are things to value and to learn. And I went to a lot of, for instance, I went to a lot of Muslim majority countries and met a lot of really warm, caring people who did not like our government, but were very kind to me and to other Americans and other nationalities that I worked with. So I have a children's book series that is trying to introduce children to Turkey because Turkey has kind of a bad reputation sometimes. And it's a lovely country with wonderful, warm people and also a complicated government. The world is complex, so we can't just think in headlines, I think. I think that's, we like to think in headlines and sound bites, and nothing is like that.
Right. It's interesting for me. I've traveled all 50 states, but not much abroad. But my Albuquerque family essentially hosts international students that come to the University of New Mexico. So for Easter or Thanksgiving, it's not unusual for us to have 35 or 40 people at the house from 20 different countries. And then sometimes, we've had students from all over the Middle East, including some countries that really don't like each other. And those people could get along just fine. I think our culture and the world's culture, tries to teach us that we shouldn't like each other, or we shouldn't tolerate things because of people that are different and come from different places. When to God, we're all His children and all made in His image, and a lot of the things that we see that divide us are not things that He's looking at in nearly the same way. Hear your perspective, being the person from America going to those different places, and how that part works. Sometimes we just don't understand culturally that things that we do and take for granted aren't done everywhere, and things that seem appropriate here are not elsewhere. But yet at the same time, people are, there's a lot of kindness and a lot of goodness that don't make the headlines and aren't part of the big news.
For sure.
That we hear.
For sure. One of my good friends in Turkey taught American culture. Like, that was her job. She'd never met an American. She'd never been to America. She taught American culture based on our movies. And
yeah, that's funny.
That was her lived experience of Americans. And we would just have lunch and she would ask me question after question. No, that's not my experience. No. And I'd tell her my experience, So that's, I remember the first time I landed in Mauritania, the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. Freaked me out. It freaked me out so much that I start my novel in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. And I thought, why am I freaked out? That it's 24, like it's all the hours of watching 24 and other, spy thrillers, and we just need to get to know each other. I love that you guys have international students over. We have Boise State here. It's got a big international community, and we were meeting. My mom met with one of the person in charge of international students, and he said like 80% of the international students never get on the inside of an American home. And I
Wow.
thought, what a tragedy, because they're not getting the whole. I mean, it's great that they're coming, but if we don't welcome them into our homes, they don't get a good full experience. And I have been welcomed into the homes of people around the world, and it has changed my perspective.
I'm sure. Most weeks they go pick up a couple of these students, and it's different ones depending on the year. But yesterday we had one from South Korea and one from Colombia, and that's pretty much the norm. I think she's probably hosted in their home. People from pretty much every continent. I don't remember one from Australia, but certainly a lot from Nigeria, from Nepal is a common one where we get students from. India, had a couple from Colombia. It's amazing that people come from all over the world. You wouldn't expect that necessarily to go to the University of New Mexico. Even when we look around, we don't realize how different we all are in whatever place we happen to find ourselves at that point. So. So how would you say you've either grown or changed the most from all of these international experiences now that you're back in Boise?
I can think of two things. One, I think my exposure to the world to greater parts of the world has made me more grateful. And I have a hard time not rolling my eyes at people who complain about different things in the United States. Certainly, we're not perfect. Nobody needs to fight for that, But the amount of good things and the way that you can rely on so many things. There are so many parts of our infrastructure and good neighbors, and this I could talk about that for an hour. I think it has broadened my view of the world for sure, and it has made me really grateful to live in this country, and this is where God chose to put me, and this is where God chose to have me born and raised. I am extremely grateful for that. The other thing I think on a spiritual side that comes to mind is, I think maybe it's not your experience, but my experience is that Christians argue a lot, and we, have church splits over things that maybe aren't gospel related, but I have lived in countries where you were so happy to see somebody else who claimed the name of Jesus that you didn't care how they worshiped him. And you didn't care that they sang music differently, or that they prayed loud or silent, or with their hands up or laying on the floor. You were just happy to be together in fellowship. And I think that has influenced me greatly in the arguments I'm willing to partake in, which are few. The way that we interpret American Christianity in this decade is different than a lot of the world. And there are positives and negatives to that. So I think I'm much less argumentative theologically than I used to be. I'm grateful for that as well.
I think I come by that perspective naturally because I grew up Catholic and I've attended a non-denominational church now for 18 years. And yes, the folks in both of those camps can find things to disagree with, but the reality is Jesus is still the same Jesus, and the probably 85, 90, maybe even 95% of the beliefs that are the same and overlap are they overlap, and we can pick at that remaining 1%, 5%, whatever that is, all we want. But I think if you really understand that Jesus himself and the main parts of what his message was for humanity, then we should celebrate those similarities between faiths and not stress out so much about the things we disagree with. It feels like that's human culture too, that we like to focus on those things that we disagree with. It makes for good argument or conversation, and I'm not a natural arguer, so maybe I just don't go down that road. Let's finish with kind of a maybe an easier question for you. So I'm a college counselor, have lots of students, and one of the things we like to talk about is study abroad programs and all of that. What would you say to a high school senior or even a college student that's listening to this that's considering a study abroad opportunity?
Do it. I mean, that's the bottom line. There are very few trips abroad that I would say are negative. I mean, negative's not the right word, but you're not gonna experience the world by going to Mexico and staying in an all-inclusive resort for a week. You're gonna have a nice, relaxing time. I'm not saying negative at all about that. I'm just saying, but most of the time, if you go abroad somewhere, you're going to have your eyes opened and you're going to have your preconceptions challenged, which is good for everybody. And you're going to have to be humiliated, which is good for everybody, because it just happens when you're learning a new culture and you're learning a new language. When I first moved to Spain, I had to live with a Spanish family for a month. That was part of my training. And they took me to dinner with their huge family and basically listed off every mistake I had made in my language learning in the first couple of weeks. And that was not even the most humiliating thing. Those are good for us. They're good for us. And I would say, get overseas if you can. If you can do it in a school structure, like a study abroad for a semester, that's great, because having a little bit of help and protection and structure is good when you're in a different culture, because you don't know the rules And even if you go somewhere like England or France or Spain, countries we're very familiar with and we think are the same, they're not. You can get in, I'm not talking like criminal or whatever in terms of trouble, but like you can get in trouble with your classmates by saying something super stupid that you did not think was stupid. And you have all these cultural misunderstandings. So having a little bit of bureaucratic structure, maybe, that a college would provide, super helpful when you're just kind of putting your toe into moving overseas. But I would always, always advise, if you have the chance, take it.
That's pretty much what I tell students, partially because I didn't take advantage of the opportunity when I had it, and then short of doing something like what you did, once you get into your career and kind of regular life, if you will, it becomes awfully difficult to do that later. And so a lot of times it's a great time to explore and expand those horizons. And if you can humble yourself and expand your comfort zone at the same time, then I think God's probably pretty pleased with the impact that experience would have on anyone.
For sure. And it's gonna impact you for the rest of your life. For a small amount of time, you can have a lot of growth.
Absolutely. Well, Jodi, thank you for taking some time to visit with us today. We appreciated you and enjoyed hearing your stories. And thank you, everyone, for listening today to the Divine Fingerprints podcast. And I hope you will join us again next time.